On my birthday, my son said he was busy, but at midnight, he begged me to spend time with him. Then I still remember that night with painful clarity because it was not loud at first. It was ordinary, and that is how humiliation usually begins when it comes from family. It was Christmas Eve in New York, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, and it was also my birthday, though no one in that house had said the word birthday out loud. I had bought myself a small cake that afternoon, vanilla with plain white frosting, nothing fancy, because I had learned not to expect too much. I placed it quietly on the kitchen counter, hoping for one simple sentence, one acknowledgement that I was still a person who existed. Bob was pacing the living room, checking his phone, while Alice moved briskly around the tree, adjusting ornaments and barking instructions at guests who had not even arrived yet. When I said softly, "Bob, do you have a minute?" he did not even look at me. He sighed and said, "Mom, I am busy. Christmas is for people who are useful." Then he glanced at the tree and added, without hesitation, "That tree has more value tonight than you do." I felt my chest tighten, but I stayed standing where I was, because sitting felt like surrender. He went on, his voice sharper now. "You are like that old fireplace in the corner. Ugly, dirty, and useless. We keep it around because throwing it out takes effort." Alice laughed, not the nervous kind, but the kind that joins in, and she said, "At least the tree makes the house look alive. You just make it smell old." I opened my mouth to speak, not to argue, just to slow the moment down, and I said, "Bob, please do not talk like that." He turned on me then, eyes cold, and said the words that landed harder than anything else. "You are not even my real mother. Stop pretending today matters." What he did not say, but what I heard clearly, was this: if today mattered, then I mattered, and he could not afford that truth. Something shifted inside me, not dramatically, not yet, but like a crack forming. Alice noticed my face and raised her voice deliberately, so anyone passing by could hear. She always does this. She ruins the mood. She brings bad energy into everything. Bob took a step closer and shouted, "Shut up. If you say one more word, I will cancel whatever pathetic birthday you think you are having." The room went quiet in that uncomfortable way where no one steps in because cruelty has already claimed the space. I stood there holding my hands together so tightly my fingers hurt, aware that I had become invisible in my own son's home. If you are listening to this, and your chest feels tight, if you have ever been made to feel like you should apologize for existing, then you already understand why moments like this stay with you forever. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button and let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening. Bob turned away from me as if I had already been dismissed, already dealt with. Alice went back to the tree, fluffing branches, correcting ornaments, speaking about how perfect everything needed to look. I realized then that perfection had no room for me. I had lived in that house for years, quietly, carefully, making myself small so I would not be accused of taking up space, and yet here I was being told that even my silence was too much. I picked up the cake and carried it to the small kitchen table, the one no one ever sat at during gatherings. I lit the single candle myself. I did not make a wish out loud. Wishing in that house felt like asking permission to exist. No one sang. No one looked over. Bob laughed at something on his phone while Alice adjusted the star at the top of the tree, admiring it as if it were alive. As I sat there, I thought about how easily they spoke of usefulness, how casually they measured worth. I had been useful once, when I paid bills on time, when I stayed quiet about things that made them uncomfortable, when I did not remind Bob where he came from or what I had given up. But usefulness, I was learning, was a condition that expired the moment you stopped serving someone else's comfort. The candle flickered, and for a brief second, I considered blowing it out without a wish, because wishing felt foolish. Then I realized something I had been avoiding for years. This was not about Christmas. This was not even about my birthday. This was about permission. They had decided I no longer had permission to exist unless I stayed silent and grateful. I blew out the candle myself. The smoke curled upward, thin and unnoticed, just like me. I looked at the tree glowing in the corner, surrounded by attention and care, and I understood with a clarity that surprised me. I was living in a place where an object was cherished more than I was, where I was tolerated only as long as I did not remind anyone of anything uncomfortable. For the first time, the truth settled in without panic or tears. I was not unwanted because I was difficult or cruel. I was unwanted because my presence reminded them of things they did not want to face. That night, watching the tree being worshipped while I sat alone with my cake, I realized I had become someone who was not allowed to exist out loud. And that realization, as painful as it was, marked the beginning of something they never saw coming. Before anyone decided I was difficult or cold, before my quiet became a flaw they used against me, I was simply a woman shaped by necessity. I grew up with very little, the kind of little that teaches you early that nothing is guaranteed and everything must be earned. I learned to measure what I had, to repair instead of replace, to save instead of indulge. There was no romance in that kind of upbringing, but there was survival. And survival leaves marks that do not fade just because life improves. When I became an adult, I carried those habits with me. I worked hard, followed rules, paid attention to details, and built a life that was steady, if not flashy. I married a man who valued the same things, and together we created a quiet, stable home in New York, one built on planning rather than promises. I was never the woman who filled rooms with laughter or comforted people with soft words. I showed love by making sure tomorrow would not fall apart. When my husband and I began talking about children, life intervened in a way we did not expect. We learned we could not have one of our own, and for a while we said nothing about it, not even to each other, as if silence might soften the truth. It was during that time that Bob entered our lives, not as a dream fulfilled, but as a reality that demanded a decision. His file was thick, heavy, with notes that made other families hesitate. His mother had left him behind, disappeared without explanation, and the language used to describe him was careful, almost apologetic, as if the system itself expected rejection. I remember sitting across from the social worker, listening to the reasons he might be difficult, and thinking only one thing, that he was still a child. I said it out loud without meaning to. He is still a child. No one is born to be left behind. That was the closest I ever came to a speech about love. We adopted Bob knowing he would not arrive as a blank slate. He carried questions we could not answer and wounds we did not cause. And I understood that my role was not to erase those things, but to give him a foundation strong enough to hold them. I did not tell him fairy tales about destiny or fate. I told him the truth as I understood it, that families are built by choices, not blood, and that responsibility is a form of care. I took him to school every day, attended meetings, made sure his vaccinations were current, and taught him rules because rules create predictability, and predictability creates safety. I did not gush over him or shower him with praise. When he did well, I nodded and said, "Good, keep going." When he struggled, I sat beside him and worked through the problem. I believed then, and I believe now, that consistency is more valuable than enthusiasm. As Bob grew older, I began to see the distance forming, subtle at first, then unmistakable. He noticed how other mothers spoke, how they hugged, how they performed warmth in public spaces. He noticed how I dressed plainly, how I spoke directly, how I did not soften truths to make them easier to hear. I could see the comparison happening behind his eyes, the quiet tallying of differences, and I did not know how to bridge that gap without becoming someone I was not. When his friends joked about adoption, I intervened, demanded respect, and made sure the school addressed it. I thought I was protecting him. What I did not understand was that to Bob, protection felt like exposure. My presence, my seriousness, my refusal to pretend, reminded him of something he wanted to forget, that he had been chosen not because he was wanted, but because someone else had left him. I never spoke badly of his biological mother. I never dramatized her absence. When he asked questions, I told him what I could and said the rest would come when he was ready. That restraint, I would later learn, became another mark against me. In his mind, my silence was not patience, but control. The more I tried to give him space to grow without shame, the more he resented the very person who knew the truth of his beginning. He wanted a story that made him ordinary, unmarked, and I was the living proof that his life had started differently. I did not realize how deeply that knowledge embarrassed him, how much he needed to separate himself from the woman who represented it. By the time Bob reached adulthood, my way of loving had become something he tolerated rather than appreciated. He wanted admiration, affirmation, and a kind of emotional performance I did not know how to give. I offered stability instead. I offered preparation. I offered a future that did not depend on appearances. To him, that felt like absence. He did not see the hours, the planning, the quiet sacrifices that never came with speeches or demands. He saw only a woman who did not fit the image he wanted to project. And so, without ever abandoning him, without ever withdrawing support, I became the reminder he wanted erased. I became, in his eyes, the evidence that he did not belong where he desperately wanted to feel at home, and that was a truth he could not forgive. The truth is, the cruelty did not begin in adulthood. It began quietly, years earlier, when Bob was still a boy and the world first taught him that difference could be used as a weapon. It started with whispers at school, the kind children think adults cannot hear. "Adopted kid," they would say when he walked past. Sometimes it was said like a joke, sometimes like a diagnosis. The worst one was charity case, tossed out during recess as if it were nothing more than a nickname. Bob came home that day with his jaw set tight, his backpack dropped harder than usual by the door. He did not cry, he did not complain. He went straight to his room, and that silence scared me more than tears ever could. I found out what had happened the following week, not from him, but from another parent who mentioned it casually, as if it were an inconvenience rather than a wound. I did not hesitate. I went to the school the next morning, sat across from administrators, and demanded they address it. I spoke clearly, calmly, the way I always did when something mattered. I said my son was being targeted and that it would stop. The school agreed, issued warnings, called parents, and suddenly the whispers became awkward glances instead. I thought I had done what any mother should do. I thought I had protected him. That afternoon, Bob did not thank me. He did not look relieved. He exploded. He accused me of embarrassing him, of making everything worse. "Now everyone knows," he shouted. "You made me look weak." I tried to explain that cruelty thrives in silence, that allowing it only teaches people it is acceptable. He cut me off with words that stunned me. "You made me look like a kid who needs saving," he said. "I would rather be hated than pitied because of you." The sentence hung between us, heavy and sharp, and I felt something tear quietly inside my chest. From that day on, a pattern formed that I did not recognize for what it was until much later. Bob was allowed to feel ashamed. Adults nodded knowingly and said it was normal, that teenagers struggle with identity, that anger was part of growing up. When he lashed out, it was framed as pain, expressing itself. But when I stepped in, when I spoke up, when I refused to let cruelty go unchallenged, my actions were labeled excessive. I was told I was overreacting, that I was making things worse, that I should let him handle it himself. His silence was maturity. My intervention was humiliation. Bob began to internalize that double standard quickly. His discomfort became something sacred, untouchable. My concern became something intrusive. If he came home angry, everyone understood. If I asked what happened, I was prying. If I suggested solutions, I was controlling. The more I tried to stand between him and harm, the more he saw me as the source of it. My presence reminded him of the very vulnerability he wanted to outrun. He did not want to be the boy who had been left. He wanted to be the boy who needed no one, and I stood in the way of that illusion simply by existing. The worst moment came one evening when I insisted on attending a school meeting about ongoing harassment. Bob refused to go. He stood in the kitchen, fists clenched, eyes blazing with a mix of fear and rage, and said the words that would stay with me for the rest of my life. "I would rather be hated than be looked at, like a charity project, because of you." He said it slowly, deliberately, as if he needed me to understand every syllable. I felt as if the air had been knocked out of me. This was not teenage frustration. This was rejection rooted in shame, and it cut deeper because I understood where it came from. I did not argue back. I did not tell him how much I had sacrificed, how carefully I had chosen him, how fiercely I had protected him since the day he came into my life. I said nothing, because I believed then that silence was patience, that love meant waiting for understanding to arrive on its own. I told myself he was young, that he would grow, that one day he would see the difference between humiliation and protection. I absorbed his anger and carried it quietly, the way I carried everything else. But silence does not erase wounds. It allows them to harden. As Bob grew older, his resentment shifted direction. The children who mocked him faded into the background, but the woman who knew his origin, who remembered his questions, who had stood up and said his name out loud, remained. I became the symbol of what he wanted to escape. He could not erase his past, but he could try to erase me. The logic was cruel and deeply unfair, yet it made perfect sense to him. If he could diminish me, dismiss me, strip me of authority and relevance, then perhaps the parts of himself he despised would finally quiet down. Looking back, I see now that the hatred did not grow from malice, but from fear. Fear of being seen as unwanted, fear of owing gratitude, fear of vulnerability. But understanding that does not soften the pain. At the time, all I knew was that my love had been recast as a liability, my protection as an insult. I chose to remain silent because I believed love could wait. I believed time would fix what anger had broken. I did not yet understand that unchallenged shame does not fade. It sharpens, and one day, it learns how to wound back. When Bob married Alice, the house did not change all at once. It narrowed. At first, it was subtle, the way silence stretches when someone new decides what is acceptable. Alice watched carefully, far more carefully than Bob ever had, and she understood him quickly. She noticed how he stiffened when anyone mentioned adoption, how his humor turned sharp when his childhood came up, how easily he agreed when someone suggested he owed me nothing. She learned where his shame lived and built herself a home inside it. I heard her say one evening, her voice calm and reassuring, "You do not owe her anything, Bob," as if she were granting him permission. Another time she added, "She did not save you. She took you in so she could feel important." Bob did not argue. He nodded, relieved, because it gave him a story where his discomfort was no longer his responsibility. From then on, my place in the house was quietly redefined. I was no longer a mother, not even a guest, but a presence to be managed. Alice spoke of me in the third person even when I was in the room. "She can stay," she would say to Bob. "It looks better if there is an older parent around. People talk when families abandon their elders." I learned that my usefulness had been reduced to optics. I was there so they would not look ungrateful, not because they wanted me. Alice began introducing me to visitors with a thin smile, calling me an old relic or dusty furniture, in a tone that made it sound like humor. People laughed uncomfortably, unsure how to respond, and I learned to smile too, because objecting only confirmed the role she had assigned me. The comparisons became constant and deliberate. Alice praised modern appliances, new designs, anything sleek and updated, then glanced at me as if to underline the point. When she wanted to insult me without using my name, she would gesture toward the corner of the living room and say, "That old fireplace should really be torn out. It takes up space, and no one even uses it anymore." Bob would laugh and agree, repeating her words later as if they were his own. The fireplace had once been something my husband and I installed together, carefully, because it was reliable and safe, because it could keep the house warm when nothing else worked. Now it became a symbol of everything Alice wanted Bob to reject: old, cautious, inconvenient. What hurt more than the names was the constant erosion of reality. If I mentioned something Alice had said the day before, she would tilt her head and reply, "I never said that," with such certainty that I would question myself. If I expressed discomfort, Bob would sigh and say, "You are imagining things. You always do that." They spoke often about my age, about memory, about how time changes perception. "You are older," Alice would say sweetly. "Sometimes you remember things differently." Over time, I began to doubt the sharpness of my own mind. I replayed conversations, wondering if I had misheard, if I had misunderstood tone. That uncertainty was the most effective tool they used, because it kept me quiet. It was after one particularly confusing argument, where Bob accused me of twisting words I knew I had heard clearly, that I began writing things down. At first it was just dates and phrases in a small notebook, a way to reassure myself that I was not losing my grip on reality. Later, when the gaslighting grew more confident, I began recording conversations openly. In our state, one-party consent made it legal, and I did not hide it. I would place my phone on the table and say, "I am recording so I do not forget." Alice would smile and reply, "Whatever makes you feel safe," in a voice that suggested the opposite. Bob laughed it off, certain it did not matter. They believed, mistakenly, that truth only exists when someone cares enough to hear it. As the years passed, the house felt less like a home and more like a museum where I was the exhibit everyone walked past. Meals happened without me being acknowledged. Decisions were made about my space, my schedule, my presence, without consultation. When I tried to contribute, I was interrupted. When I stayed silent, I was accused of sulking. There was no correct way to exist. Alice was careful never to shout. Her cruelty lived in repetition, in the steady message that I was outdated, unnecessary, and lucky to be tolerated. Bob absorbed that message eagerly, because it freed him from gratitude. The fireplace remained untouched, a quiet witness. I remembered installing it with my husband, measuring everything twice, choosing parts that would last, not because they were fashionable, but because they were dependable. I knew how the system worked, how to adjust the airflow, how to keep the pipes from freezing when temperatures dropped. Bob dismissed that knowledge as irrelevant. "That safety stuff is junk," he said once, removing a component because it looked old. "We have modern systems now," I warned him gently, explaining why it mattered, but Alice rolled her eyes and said, "She is stuck in the past." Bob agreed, because agreeing with her meant distancing himself from me. By then, I understood that I was being erased in stages. First my authority, then my voice, then my reality. I was not beaten or screamed at. I was reduced, turned into an object that could be mocked, ignored, or moved aside. The recordings and notes were not acts of revenge. They were lifelines, proof that what I experienced was real, that I was not imagining the slow violence of being diminished day after day. I stopped trying to correct them. I stopped explaining myself. I conserved my energy and watched. In that quiet observation, I began to see the pattern clearly. They needed me small so they could feel whole. And once I understood that, I knew this could not last forever, because nothing built on denial remains stable. Midnight arrived quietly at first, marked only by the soft click of the old clock down the hall, and then the house went dark all at once, not dim, not flickering, but gone, as if someone had reached in and erased the light with a single motion. The music cut off mid-note, the hum of appliances fell silent, and the sudden stillness felt heavier than noise ever had. A moment later, the cold announced itself, creeping in through walls that had relied too long on systems no one understood anymore. I sat up in bed, already aware of what this meant, because I had lived long enough to recognize the difference between inconvenience and danger. The modern heating system had stopped, and in a New York winter, that was not a small problem. From the hallway, I heard confused voices, the scrape of furniture, Bob's irritated pacing as he tried switches that would not respond. The temperature dropped quickly, the kind of drop you feel in your bones before you can name it. I wrapped my sweater tighter and waited, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I knew what they did not, that the pipes would not forgive ignorance, that time mattered now. The old fireplace, the one they mocked and dismissed, was not decorative. It was the last line of defense against frozen lines and ruptured walls. But Bob had removed the safety regulator months earlier, calling it junk, saying the house had moved on. He had not listened when I warned him. He never listened when I spoke quietly. The knock on my door came hesitant, uneven, nothing like the confident footsteps I had learned to brace myself against. When he spoke, his voice cracked in a way I had not heard since he was a child afraid of thunderstorms. "Mom," he said, and the word landed with a weight it had not carried in years. He paused, as if unsure whether he was allowed to continue, then added, Please. I opened the door and saw him standing there in the dark, his face pale, his posture smaller, the bravado gone. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He said, "Can you come sit with me?" And then, barely above a whisper, "I do not want to be alone." In that moment, I heard two voices in him, the man who had told me to get out, and the boy who had once crept into my room after nightmares, ashamed to admit fear. The house groaned softly around us as the cold pressed in, and I understood the truth he could not yet say. He was not afraid of the temperature. He was afraid of being abandoned, of being left without anyone to anchor him, the same fear that had followed him since the beginning. I felt it stir something old in me, the instinct to step forward and absorb the fear for him, to smooth it away at my own expense. That instinct had shaped my life. It no longer ruled it. I walked past him without touching him and went to the living room, moving with purpose. Alice hovered near the doorway, silent now, watching as if this were a test she did not understand. I knelt by the fireplace and assessed the damage quickly, noting what was missing, what had been altered. The regulator was gone, the airflow misaligned, the kind of careless change that looks harmless until it fails you. I corrected what I could, working methodically, because panic has never solved anything. Bob hovered behind me, his breath loud in the cold, his confidence completely gone. He asked questions I did not answer, not to punish him, but because this was not the moment for explanations. When the fire finally caught properly, the warmth returned slowly, the way safety always does, inch by inch, rather than all at once. I adjusted the settings carefully, ensuring the pipes would be protected, ensuring the house would survive the night. Only then did I stand and turn to face him. He looked relieved, shaken, embarrassed, all at once, and for a second he opened his mouth as if to speak, as if an apology might find its way out. I stopped him with a raised hand, not in anger, but in boundary. "I'm helping because it is the right thing to do," I said evenly, "not because I was treated right." The words settled between us, undeniable. He nodded, not trusting himself to respond, and for the first time I saw understanding flicker, not as gratitude, but as realization. The fireplace crackled softly, doing its work without recognition, just as I always had. I did not sit beside him. I did not offer comfort. I returned to my room once I knew the house was stable, because compassion does not require self-erasure. As I closed my door, I felt no triumph, only a steady resolve. I had helped without surrendering myself, and that difference mattered. Midnight had taken something from him that night, his certainty, his arrogance, his illusion of independence. It gave me something instead, confirmation that my worth had never depended on their approval, only on my willingness to stop abandoning myself. When the fire had settled into a steady rhythm and the house no longer felt like it was holding its breath, Bob sat down heavily at the edge of the couch, his hands shaking as if the cold had moved inside him and refused to leave. For a long moment he said nothing, staring at the floor, and I could feel something pressing to the surface that had been buried for years. Finally he spoke, his voice rough and unsteady, and said, "I hated you because I thought you were hiding something from me." He swallowed hard and continued, "Every time you stayed calm, every time you told me I would understand later, it felt like control. It felt like you were keeping me small." He looked up at me then, eyes red, and added the sentence he had never allowed himself to say out loud. "And I hated you because I was afraid I owed you my whole life." I listened without interrupting, because this was not a confession meant to be corrected, it was a wound finally exposed to air. He spoke faster after that, words tumbling over each other as if they had been waiting. He told me how unbearable gratitude felt, how suffocating it was to think that his existence depended on someone else's mercy, how he wanted to believe he had earned everything on his own. "If I admit you chose me," he said, "then I have to admit I was unwanted first." The truth of it landed heavily in the room, and I understood then that his cruelty had never been about hatred, it had been about escape. I stood and walked to the small drawer where I had kept something untouched for decades, not out of fear, but out of care. I took out the envelope, yellowed at the edges, addressed in handwriting that had once trembled across the page. I returned and placed it on the table between us. I was not hiding this to control you, I said quietly. I was holding it so it would not break you. He stared at the envelope as if it might disappear if he looked away, and I told him what it was before he could ask. It was a letter from his biological mother, written years after the adoption, brief and careful, requesting no contact and no future connection. The words were not cruel, just final. I never told you because I wanted you to grow up whole, I said, my voice steady even as the memory pressed in, not waiting to be rejected again by someone who had already left. Bob picked up the letter with trembling fingers and read it, his face collapsing as the truth settled in. The woman he had imagined, the one he had chased in his mind as proof that he had been wanted somewhere, had chosen absence again. The room filled with the quiet sound of something breaking that could not be repaired. He covered his face with his hands and shook, grief tearing through him now that there was nowhere left to redirect it. For a long time, he said nothing. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hollow, stripped of the defenses that had once made him cruel. She did not want me, he said, as if the sentence needed to be spoken to exist. I nodded, not to confirm pain, but to acknowledge reality. But I did, I replied. I chose you every day. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime, and I did not soften them to spare him. He needed truth now, not protection. Alice, who had been standing near the doorway, shifted uncomfortably, the change in the room unsettling her. She stepped forward and said sharply, "This is all unnecessary. You are making him feel worse." And when Bob did not respond, she turned her frustration toward him. "You cannot fall apart over this. We have an image to maintain." Her words cut through the moment, revealing something that had always been there but never named. Bob looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time saw the distance where support should have been. She was not mourning with him. She was calculating. As the weight of the letter settled, Alice's patience wore thin. She began blaming him for the night, for the power outage, for the damage, her voice sharp and defensive. "None of this would have happened if you had handled things better," she snapped, already rewriting events to protect herself. Bob did not answer. He sat still, the truth too heavy to move around, and I saw the first crack in a marriage built on avoidance and performance. Without me as the scapegoat, there was nowhere for the tension to go, but between them. I did not take pleasure in his collapse. I felt sorrow, deep and complicated, because no parent wants to be right at the cost of their child's pain. But I also felt clarity. The story Bob had been running from had finally caught up to him, and no one could save him from it. Not me, not Alice, not the life he had constructed. He had to face the truth that the woman he despised was the only one who had chosen him without conditions. I gathered the letter and placed it back in the envelope, not to hide it again, but to put it where it belonged, in the past, acknowledged but no longer powerful. Bob watched me. His expression changed, stripped of accusation, filled instead with something like understanding, and I knew this moment would alter him, whether he wanted it to or not. I did not offer comfort. I did not promise forgiveness. I had already given him the most honest gift I had left, the truth delivered without cruelty. Whatever he did with it would be his responsibility now. Morning came slowly, pale and unforgiving, revealing what the night had hidden. The warmth from the fireplace had held, but the damage had already been done. A thin line of water traced the base of the wall near the kitchen, spreading quietly across the floor, and the air carried the sharp smell of damp plaster. Bob stood there staring at it, as if the sight might rearrange itself if he looked long enough. He kept saying the same thing under his breath, that it did not make sense, that it should not have happened, that modern systems were not supposed to fail. I did not correct him. I had already explained what mattered, and explanations only work when someone is ready to accept them. The plumber arrived mid-morning, boots wet, voice flat with experience. He pointed out the ruptured section, the missing safety regulator, the evidence of unauthorized modifications. Bob tried to argue, insisting the parts were outdated, that he had improved the system. But the plumber shook his head and said improvement does not mean removal. The insurance adjuster followed, polite and distant, noting everything carefully, and when Bob asked about coverage, the answer came measured and final. Unauthorized changes voided responsibility. The damage would be their problem to handle. Alice grew tight-lipped, already calculating costs and appearances, her earlier confidence replaced by irritation. She spoke about inconvenience, about timing, about how unfair it all was, and I watched the way she never once asked if anyone was hurt. I did not comment. I went to my room and began packing what belonged to me. There was no rush, no dramatic exit, only the calm that comes when a decision has settled. I chose a small suitcase and placed my things inside, carefully, the way I always had, folding clothes I had worn for years, gathering documents I had protected quietly. I left behind what did not matter, items that had accumulated because I was never asked what I wanted. The house felt different as I moved through it, not hostile anymore, just finished. The recordings and notes went into my bag last, not as leverage, but as reminders of why staying was no longer an option. Bob appeared in the doorway as I zipped the suitcase, his face drawn, eyes searching for something I could not give him. He asked where I was going, his voice unsure, and I told him I had made arrangements, nothing elaborate, just a place where my presence did not need justification. He said my name the way he had as a child, uncertain and hopeful, and for a moment I saw the boy who had once believed I could fix anything. That belief had been both our comfort and our undoing. I met his gaze and felt no anger, only the weight of understanding. Alice hovered behind him, arms crossed, impatience visible now that there was nothing left to manage. She spoke about logistics, about how this would look, about what people would say, and Bob flinched at her words in a way he never had before. The shift was subtle but real. Without me absorbing the blame, their fractures showed. I did not stay to watch it widen. I lifted the suitcase and walked toward the door. Bob followed me into the hallway, his steps quickening. He reached out, not touching me, just close enough to ask if I could stay, if we could talk more, if things could be different now. I stopped and turned to face him fully, not to argue, not to revisit the past, but to speak the truth cleanly. I was not born to be your mother, I said quietly. I chose that, every day. You never chose me back. The words were not sharp, they did not need to be. They landed because they were accurate. Bob's face collapsed into something raw, and for the first time, he did not defend himself. He did not explain. He simply stood there, understanding, arriving too late to change what mattered. I stepped outside into the cold, the air clear and steady, and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for years. The city moved as it always did, indifferent and alive, and I realized how long it had been since I felt part of it. I went to a place I had arranged quietly, small and warm, where no one asked me to shrink or perform. For the first time in decades, I spent Christmas without tension in my shoulders, without measuring my words, without bracing for dismissal. There were no decorations to impress anyone, no audience to manage, only peace that arrived without conditions. In the days that followed, I heard bits and pieces through others, not because I sought them out, but because truth travels. The repairs were costly. The insurance dispute dragged on. Alice grew sharper, less patient, and Bob grew quieter, the weight of responsibility settling where entitlement had once lived. I did not intervene. I had already done enough intervening for one lifetime. When Bob called, his voice tentative, I listened, but I did not return. Not because I did not care, but because care no longer meant sacrifice. People like to imagine that endings like this are about punishment or victory. They are not. They are about correction. I did not leave to hurt anyone. I left to stop hurting myself. The satisfaction did not come from watching consequences unfold, but from knowing I no longer had to absorb them on someone else's behalf. I reclaimed my time, my space, my right to exist without apology. That is a quiet kind of justice, the kind that does not announce itself but lasts. If there is one thing this life has taught me, it is that love chosen freely is powerful, but love demanded through guilt is corrosive. When my son told me to get out, he forgot one important thing. I had been preparing for that moment for a very long time. I did not walk away defeated. I walked away ready, carrying with me the dignity I had protected all along, intact, and finally, my own. If this story moved you, helped you feel seen, or reminded you that it is never too late to choose yourself, please subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Your support keeps these voices alive and ensures that stories like this reach others who may still be sitting in rooms where they are told to be silent. Every subscription is a reminder that wisdom does not fade with age, it deepens. Thank you for listening. Thank you for honoring my voice. And remember this: when a woman stops shrinking to make others comfortable, she does not become cruel, she becomes free.